The Reckoning. The streets of Greenville seemed to breathe a little easier that evening, as if the weight of the day's events had not only shifted within the walls of the police station but had rippled outwards into the community itself. The sun was beginning its descent behind the horizon, casting an orange glow over the city. It was a peaceful scene, one that felt in stark contrast to the tension and turmoil that had unfolded inside the station just hours earlier. Sophia sat quietly in the passenger seat of Michael's car, the soft hum of the engine accompanying their contemplative silence. She had not spoken much since leaving the station, and Michael, ever the observant partner, had not pressed her for words. The drive was a short one, but it felt like an eternity. It was not just the physical distance they were traveling but the emotional weight that lay between them. Sophia had been through a whirlwind of emotions since the moment Ethan first laid hands on her: anger, fear, disbelief. But through it all, there had been something else. A quiet certainty that had carried her through each moment. She had known, deep in her soul, that this wasn't just about a wrongful arrest, it was about something far greater. It was about the belief that justice should be blind, that every person, regardless of their background, should be treated equally under the law. But more than that, it was about standing up to systems that perpetuated inequality, no matter how entrenched they were. As they turned onto the familiar street leading to their home, Michael glanced over at Sophia. He saw the tiredness in her eyes, the weariness that spoke of battles fought on invisible fronts. But there was also something else. Something stronger. A quiet resilience that was impossible to miss. She had not just survived this ordeal, she had faced it head-on, and in doing so, she had laid the foundation for something greater than just her own redemption. "Do you want to talk about it?" Michael asked gently, his voice soft but filled with genuine concern. Sophia hesitated for a moment, gazing out the window as the world passed by. She was still processing everything: the anger she had felt, the shock of Michael's arrival at the station, the deep sense of betrayal when Ethan had assumed the worst about her. But there was something else she felt too. Something more profound. She felt a sense of purpose. "I don't know where to start," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I know that what happened today wasn't just about me. I want to make sure it never happens again. Not just here, but everywhere." Michael nodded, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. He knew exactly what she meant. He had seen the look in her eyes when she had faced Ethan in the holding cell, when she had confronted him not with anger, but with the undeniable weight of truth. She had stood there as a symbol, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been wronged by prejudice, by assumption, by the quiet systems of inequality that worked tirelessly behind closed doors. "I think this is only the beginning, Sophia," Michael said. "We can't let this go. If we want things to change, if we want people to understand that justice means equality for all, we have to lead by example. We have to be the ones to set the standard." Sophia turned her gaze back to him, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "That's exactly what I was thinking," she said, her voice gaining strength. "This isn't just about exposing one officer's mistake. It's about showing everyone that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. It's about showing that we won't back down. Not now, not ever." Michael nodded, a quiet pride swelling in his chest as he glanced over at her. He had always known Sophia was strong. But today, in that moment of crisis, he had witnessed something else, something deeper, something more powerful than he had ever anticipated. She was more than just his wife, she was a force of nature, capable of inspiring change in the most difficult of circumstances. As they pulled into their driveway, Michael parked the car and turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The quiet of the evening seemed to hang around them, but there was something urgent in the air now, an unspoken understanding that their fight had only just begun. "I think we need to do something about this," Michael said, finally breaking the silence. "Something bigger than just this town. I know that there's more to this than just Ethan's mistake. This is about addressing the culture, the assumptions, the biases that are embedded in every level of our system." Sophia's eyes softened as she looked at him. She knew exactly what he was saying. This wasn't just about one officer, one mistake. This was about the culture of policing, the systemic issues that ran far deeper than any one individual. It was about breaking the cycle. But she also knew that taking that first step, shining a light on the problem, would not be easy. "I agree," she said quietly. "But we can't do it alone. We need allies. People who are willing to stand up with us and take the first step toward real change. People who will speak out when they see injustice, even if it's uncomfortable. We need to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Michael's gaze hardened with resolve. "We'll start with the truth. We'll make sure people know what happened today, not just the arrest, but the reason behind it. And then we'll start pushing for change. At every level." Sophia nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid of standing up for what was right, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths and risking everything they had built together. Because she knew, truly knew, that the truth was the most powerful weapon they had. And with it, they could change the world. As they stepped out of the car and into the house, Michael wrapped his arm around Sophia's shoulders, pulling her close. The warmth of their home, the soft glow of the lights inside, felt like a stark contrast to the events they had just experienced. But in that moment, it was a reminder that they were still here. Still together. Still strong. "I'm proud of you," Michael said, his voice low and full of admiration. "You didn't just handle today with grace, you handled it with courage. And now, we'll do what needs to be done." Sophia leaned into him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. She knew that the road ahead would be long, and there would be many more battles to fight. But as long as they stood together, side by side, she knew they could overcome anything. The next day, the first steps were taken. Michael went to the station and spoke to his superiors, demanding a full investigation into Ethan's actions and filing a formal complaint. He also made it clear that the department's approach to policing needed to be re-evaluated, with a renewed focus on community engagement, racial sensitivity training, and internal accountability. Sophia, meanwhile, took to social media to share her story, not just for herself, but for all the women and men who had ever been subjected to prejudice, to assumptions based on their appearance, their skin color, or their background. She spoke out about the unjust treatment she had endured and called for a broader societal conversation about racism in law enforcement. The response was overwhelming. People from all over the country shared their own stories, many of them echoing the same painful experiences of discrimination and bias that Sophia had faced. It became clear that this wasn't just one woman's battle, it was a movement. A movement that could no longer be ignored. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, public statements, and rallies. But amidst the noise, one thing was clear: Sophia and Michael's fight was far from over. They had uncovered a deeper truth about the systems that controlled so much of their lives, and now, they would be the ones to help dismantle it. Their journey had only just begun. But with every step, they knew they were one step closer to creating a world where justice wasn't a privilege, it was a right for all. The heart of the storm. The tension in the police station was palpable. It was as if the very air itself had thickened with anticipation. Officers, who moments ago were going about their duties with the indifferent routine of any ordinary day, now stood frozen in place, their eyes darting between Michael and Ethan. The captain's presence was a force unto itself, and with every passing second, the stakes grew higher, as if the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Sophia sat silently in the holding area, her hands still resting on her lap, though her posture was strong and composed. The soft clink of the handcuffs was the only sound as Michael's voice carried with authority across the room, making it clear that something bigger than just her arrest was at play. Michael's eyes locked onto Ethan, who was still attempting to recover from the shock of Michael's sudden arrival. Ethan's face, once flushed with the confidence of authority, had now turned pale, his lips trembling with uncertainty. The smugness that had dominated his demeanor earlier had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that seemed to grow with every passing second. "I don't need to remind you, Ethan," Michael's voice cut through the stillness like a blade, "that our job is to uphold justice, not to impose our biases on the people we serve. You've made a grave mistake, one that can't be swept under the rug." Ethan, who had been standing rigidly behind his desk, opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He swallowed, trying to find his footing, but nothing seemed to work. He had thought his gut feeling, his instinct about Sophia, would be enough to justify his actions, but now, standing before Michael, it was clear that he had crossed a line he couldn't easily come back from. I didn't think it would be a big deal," Ethan finally stammered, his voice shaking with a mix of guilt and fear. "She was acting suspicious. The necklace, the way she was dressed. It just didn't sit right with me." Michael stepped forward, his voice now cold and measured, the kind of calm that only comes when you are fully in control of the situation. "What didn't sit right with you, Ethan? The fact that a woman of color had the audacity to wear something expensive? Or was it just that her confidence rubbed you the wrong way?" The word stung, and for the briefest moment, Sophia saw Ethan's gaze flicker with something deeper, an emotion too complex to name, but undeniable nonetheless. It was fear, yes, but also shame. He had been caught, and not just by Michael, but by the very system he thought he controlled. The truth of the matter was out now. Ethan's arrest of Sophia wasn't based on any logical suspicion, nor was it rooted in evidence. It was based on a deep-seated prejudice, a dangerous assumption that someone like her couldn't possibly own something of value without it being stolen. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around Ethan, tightening with every accusation. Michael stood in front of him, unwavering, a tower of integrity and justice, while Ethan shrunk back, unable to meet the captain's gaze. "Do you have any evidence?" Michael's voice was cutting, like a surgeon's scalpel. "Do you have anything other than your assumptions to justify what you did to my wife? I'll tell you right now, if you can't provide any, we'll have a very different conversation when this is all over." There was a long silence. Ethan, now completely deflated, opened his mouth once more but couldn't find the words. The officers around him were quiet now, their eyes flicking from Michael to Ethan and back again, uncomfortable in the heavy silence. It was clear that they knew what had happened, even if they hadn't been bold enough to speak out. Injustice had been done. And even if they hadn't personally been involved, they were all complicit in a system that allowed things like this to happen. Sophia's heart raced, but it wasn't with fear. She was proud of Michael, proud of how he handled himself, how he was confronting the issue head-on without flinching. This was the moment she had been waiting for, not just to clear her name, but to help dismantle the kind of thinking that allowed people like Ethan to wield power with such recklessness. The difference now was that she wasn't alone in the fight. Michael was here. And with him, she knew that the truth would prevail. After what felt like an eternity, Michael broke the silence. "Take her cuffs off." "Now," he commanded, his voice low but firm. Ethan, still visibly shaken, stood frozen for a moment, almost unsure of what to do. But under Michael's steely gaze, he stepped forward reluctantly, his hands fumbling with the cold metal of the cuffs. With a quiet click, the restraints were removed from Sophia's wrists, and for the first time since her arrest, she could feel the weight of the metal lifted off her, the slight sting of her skin where the cuffs had dug in. Sophia stood slowly, her eyes never leaving Michael's. His presence was a balm, a source of quiet strength in a world that so often seemed to turn a blind eye to injustice. Michael reached for her hand, and for a moment, the world outside the station disappeared. They were two people, united not just by love but by a shared sense of justice that refused to be quashed. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, his voice softening as he looked down at her, his concern evident. Sophia nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. "I'm fine, Michael. Just a little tired. But I'm okay." James, who had been standing off to the side, watching the interaction, stepped forward tentatively. "Captain," he said, his voice cautious but firm. "I just want to say that I didn't agree with how this was handled. I've known Sophia for years, and I never thought she would do something like that. But I didn't have the authority to stop it." Michael's gaze shifted to James, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath once more. "You're not the one who arrested her, James. But what matters now is what we do with what we know. I appreciate you speaking up, though. We need more people who are willing to stand for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." James nodded, clearly relieved, but still conflicted. He knew that Michael's words meant something deeper. They were a reminder that sometimes, standing up for the truth meant stepping outside the comfort of the status quo, challenging the very systems that had once made him feel safe. Meanwhile, Ethan stood to the side, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions settling heavily on him. He had always thought of himself as someone above reproach, someone who followed the rules and kept the peace. But today, in the face of Michael's authority and Sophia's quiet strength, he realized just how fragile that illusion had been. His actions hadn't kept the peace, they had disrupted it. They had created a rift between what was right and what was convenient. Sophia turned toward him, her eyes meeting his for the first time since he had arrested her. There was no malice in her gaze, just the quiet understanding of someone who had been wronged but had no desire to perpetuate that wrong. "You should know," she said, her voice calm but steady, "that this isn't just about me. You hurt everyone by doing this, your colleagues, your community. The people you're supposed to protect." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. Instead, he lowered his head, too ashamed to meet her eyes. Michael watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. He wasn't interested in punishing Ethan. That wasn't the point. The point was to remind him, and everyone else, that the pursuit of justice didn't just end with the guilty, it began with those who had the courage to challenge the status quo. And that was where this story would begin to shift. Because as Michael and Sophia walked out of the police station, hand in hand, there was no doubt in either of their minds that this was far from over. It wasn't just about one wrongful arrest, it was about changing the system that allowed such things to happen in the first place. And they were ready to fight for that change. The breaking point. The silence of the holding cell was suffocating. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, the weight of time pressing heavily on Sophia's chest. She could hear the murmurs of officers outside, the shuffle of footsteps, the clink of keys, the routine sounds of a police station that never seemed to stop. But inside the cell, there was only the rhythmic thumping of her heart, a constant reminder that this wasn't just a test of patience, it was a test of endurance. Sophia's mind raced, every thought a flash of sharp clarity, each one bouncing between her fears and her resolve. She had known injustice before, had witnessed the prejudice that often ran unchecked in the world. But this was different. This wasn't just about her, this was about a system that could so easily disregard the truth, silence the voices of the innocent, and uphold a status quo that thrived on division. But Sophia wasn't going to let that happen. She couldn't. Not for herself, not for the countless others who had suffered in silence. She had been given a voice, a platform as the wife of Michael, a police chief who prided himself on fairness and justice. She wasn't going to waste that opportunity by staying silent. She would stand, not just for her own dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had been unfairly cast aside. As she sat in the cold metal chair, the oppressive silence seemed to close in around her. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, steadying herself. The room was stark, void of any warmth or comfort. It was a place where people were forgotten, where their lives and stories were reduced to nothing more than a case number, a file to be tucked away. But Sophia's story wouldn't be tucked away. Not this time. She was jolted from her thoughts as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. The door to the holding area opened with a sharp creak, and for a moment, she tensed, instinctively readying herself for whatever was to come next. She had long since learned to expect the unexpected, but even in this moment of tension, she refused to show fear. The figure that stepped inside was not Ethan. It was another officer, one she recognized, a young man with a quiet demeanor, someone who had always seemed more interested in doing things right than in asserting his power. His name was James, a patrol officer who had worked under Michael for years. He had a reputation for fairness, even-handedness, and a genuine desire to serve the people of Greenville. In his eyes, Sophia saw something different from the contempt she had felt earlier. It wasn't much, but it was something. Empathy, maybe. James paused at the door, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure no one else was watching. When his eyes met Sophia's, he gave a slight nod, a gesture that seemed small but spoke volumes. Without saying a word, he stepped inside, his presence a quiet reassurance amidst the storm she found herself in. I'm sorry about this, ma'am," James said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. He hesitated for a moment, as though unsure whether to continue, but then he spoke again, his words coming faster now. "I don't think this was handled the right way. I've known you and your husband for years. I can't imagine how this must feel for you." Sophia looked up at him, her expression neutral but appreciative of his candor. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm but laced with a quiet intensity. "But it's not just me. This is about a bigger issue. About a system that lets things like this happen, day after day. People are judged before they're even given a chance to speak. And when that happens, when the system fails to protect the innocent, it's not just the victim who suffers. Everyone does." James swallowed, clearly struggling with the weight of her words. His eyes flickered to the door as if considering whether to leave or continue this brief conversation. "I agree with you. But there's only so much I can do. Ethan's already made his case, and I'm not sure how much influence I have in this situation." Sophia's gaze softened slightly, though the sharpness of her thoughts never wavered. "You're a good officer, James. You've always done what's right. But sometimes, doing what's right isn't just about following orders. It's about standing up when you know something is wrong." James seemed to wrestle with those words, his gaze flickering away as though grappling with an internal battle. Finally, he nodded, though his expression was a mix of frustration and helplessness. "I'll try to talk to the others," he said quietly. "Maybe there's still a chance to straighten this out. But I don't have much pull with Ethan. He's set on this." Sophia gave him a small, encouraging smile, though her heart was heavy. She knew better than to expect miracles, but even the smallest flicker of support was better than nothing at all. She had seen this before, the divide between those who wanted change and those who were willing to keep things the way they were, even when it meant letting people suffer. James was caught between those two worlds, and Sophia couldn't blame him for his hesitation. The system was a machine, and it didn't easily bend. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, James," she said softly. "But I won't let this go. Not until the truth is out there, no matter how difficult that might be for people to hear." James didn't answer at first. He only stood there for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he turned toward the door, pausing as he reached the threshold. "I'll do what I can," he said quietly. "Just hang in there." Sophia watched him leave, her mind already moving to the next steps, to the moments that lay ahead. She had no intention of sitting idly by. Michael would be here soon, and when he arrived, things would change. She could feel it in her bones. The wheels were already in motion. Outside, as the minutes dragged on, the atmosphere in the station grew heavier. The other officers went about their duties, but their eyes kept flicking toward the holding area, their conversations lowering to hushed whispers whenever they thought they were out of earshot. Sophia didn't care. She knew what was coming. And when it came, it would come fast. Just as she was steeling herself for whatever might happen next, the door to the holding area opened once again, but this time, the figure standing in the doorway was different. He moved with purpose, his footsteps quick and determined. As soon as she saw him, her heart leaped in her chest. Michael. Her husband entered the holding area with a quiet intensity, his commanding presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone nearby. His eyes met hers from across the room, and despite the distance, she felt a surge of relief. No words were exchanged, but in that moment, she didn't need to say anything. He was here. And that was all that mattered. Michael's gaze quickly shifted to Ethan, who was still sitting behind the desk, clearly caught off guard by Michael's sudden arrival. The tension in the room thickened, the air becoming heavy with unspoken words. "You," Michael said, his voice low and dangerous as he addressed Ethan. The other officers in the room fell silent, the weight of Michael's words palpable. "What the hell is going on here?" Ethan stammered, clearly caught off guard by the force of Michael's presence. I thought she was stealing." "Enough," Michael interrupted, his voice cutting through Ethan's excuses like a knife. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man who had dared to arrest his wife. "Do you have any evidence? Any proof that she's done anything wrong? Or is this just another case of your arrogance and prejudice talking?" Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face was flushed with embarrassment, and for the first time, Sophia saw the cracks in his facade. The man who had so confidently arrested her was now reduced to nothing more than a floundering figure, his power crumbling in the face of Michael's authority. Sophia's gaze remained on Michael, a quiet strength building within her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about justice. And Michael was about to deliver it. The walls that close in. The ride to the station was a blur of cold metal and uncomfortable silence. The constant hum of the patrol car's engine reverberated through the walls, but for Sophia, the sounds outside seemed distant, as though they belonged to another world entirely. Inside the car, there was nothing but the oppressive presence of Officer Ethan Clark, who drove with his eyes fixed straight ahead, his hand resting casually on the wheel. His posture remained rigid, a self-satisfied grin playing at the corners of his lips as if he had already won. Sophia's thoughts, however, were far from the present moment. The harsh grip of the handcuffs biting into her wrists reminded her of the weight of injustice, but her mind refused to succumb to the panic she knew could so easily overwhelm her. She had been in enough tense situations to recognize the insidious crawl of fear, the way it could seep into your bones if you allowed it. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not today. Her gaze flicked to the window, but instead of the familiar view of Greenville's tree-lined streets, she saw only the reflection of herself in the glass. The woman she saw was strong, but the woman she had been just a few minutes ago seemed so far away, as if she were looking at someone else entirely. The confident, graceful Sophia who had walked the streets with her head held high, secure in her place, now felt as if she were wearing the skin of someone unfamiliar. The cold metal cuffs seemed to have stripped her of her identity, reduced her to just another statistic, another victim in a system that often failed to recognize the humanity of people who looked like her. She took a slow breath, closing her eyes for a moment as the car turned a corner, the streets growing more and more familiar. The station was just a few minutes away. She could almost smell the sterile, antiseptic air that would greet her once the car stopped, hear the clatter of voices as officers moved about their work. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the reality of the situation. She was being taken into custody under false pretenses, judged by nothing more than a man's gut feeling. She hadn't expected to be treated this way. She was the wife of the chief of police, a woman who had never broken the law, who had spent her entire life striving to make a difference, to contribute positively to her community. She wasn't the type to be arrested. But that was the point, wasn't it? Officer Ethan Clark had already made up his mind before she even opened her mouth. She was the enemy in his eyes, the one who had dared to walk down the street without fear, without bowing to the invisible lines of hierarchy that he believed were meant to keep people in their place. The moment she had stood her ground, the moment she had not flinched at his demands, she had become a threat. Sophia's phone buzzed in her pocket, the small vibration sending a ripple of hope through her chest. Michael. She had sent him a subtle alert before getting into the car, a silent cry for help. He would come. He always came when she needed him most. But even as the hope blossomed inside her, a gnawing uncertainty lingered. What would Michael find when he got to the station? Would he be able to fix this, or had Ethan already taken the situation too far? The car slowed as it neared the entrance to the police station, the tall stone building looming ahead like a fortress, its grey walls cold and unyielding. As they pulled into the parking lot, Sophia could feel the pressure in her chest intensify. Her breath quickened slightly, but she kept her composure, her face a mask of calm, though inside, she was anything but calm. The world outside the car seemed to shrink, the sounds muffled as the moment she had feared approached. The doors of the station opened, and officers moved in and out like clockwork, their faces unreadable. Ethan parked the car with a jarring thud and opened the door, roughly pulling Sophia out of the car. The handcuffs were tight, biting into her skin as he shoved her forward, his grip unrelenting. "Get inside," he growled, his voice full of smug satisfaction. He led her toward the entrance of the station, ignoring the occasional glance from passing officers. To them, it was just another arrest, just another face in the crowd. But to Sophia, this was everything. This was a test of everything she had ever believed in: justice, fairness, the system. She wasn't just walking into a building now, she was walking into the very heart of an institution that had failed so many people like her. The interior of the police station was as cold and sterile as she had imagined. The walls were lined with metal desks, each one occupied by officers who worked in a blur of motion. There was the faint scent of coffee and paper, a low murmur of voices that faded in and out of her hearing. She could feel their eyes on her, some curious, others skeptical, but none of them questioning the situation. Ethan didn't bother to explain what had happened. He simply marched her toward the holding area at the back of the station, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As they passed by a row of offices, Sophia caught glimpses of her husband's colleagues. She recognized a few of them, but none of them seemed to be paying her any mind. To them, she was just another woman in handcuffs. When they reached the holding area, Ethan opened the door to a small cell with whitewashed walls and a single metal chair. It was nothing but a cold, impersonal space meant for detaining those who were caught in the system, a system that didn't care to understand the nuances of a person's life, the context of their actions, or the fairness of their treatment. "Sit," Ethan commanded, his tone harsh, his eyes scanning her with contempt. Sophia stepped inside, her body stiff but her head held high. She didn't speak, didn't look back at him. She simply sat on the metal chair, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, the coldness of the room matching the coldness she felt inside. She could hear Ethan muttering under his breath as he left the holding area, the door slamming shut behind him. The sound reverberated in her ears, as though the finality of that action had sealed her fate. But Sophia wasn't afraid. She had been through far worse in her life, had seen the injustices that others suffered in silence, and had learned how to fight back. She wouldn't let this define her. She wouldn't let Ethan Clark win. Not today. As the minutes ticked by, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Her mind wandered to Michael. What would he be doing now? Was he at the station already, looking for her? She couldn't be sure, but she knew one thing for certain: Michael would not let this go. He would come for her. He always did. She also thought about the city she loved, the people she had helped, and the ones who had supported her through the years. This wasn't just about her, it was about all of them. The people who had been judged, the people who had been wronged, the ones who had never had the chance to tell their side of the story. She could be their voice now. This moment could be the turning point. At that thought, a quiet resolve settled over her. She wasn't just going to sit here and wait for someone else to act. She was going to fight, in whatever way she could. The fight for justice, for respect, for the right to live without fear of being judged for the color of her skin, would not be lost in the quiet shadows of this cell. Outside, the clock ticked on, the hands moving relentlessly toward the moment when everything would change. The unseen chains. It was a warm afternoon in Greenville, a city where the pulse of life was as constant as the hum of the traffic on Main Street. The city was a place where dreams and struggles mingled like the bustling crowd in the town square. From the raucous laughter echoing from the local cafes to the rhythmic clinking of coins in the hands of street vendors, Greenville was alive with energy, a far cry from the cold, sterile environment of its police station. Sophia Turner walked down the cobbled sidewalks with a quiet grace, the late afternoon sun catching the gold of the necklace around her neck. It wasn't just any piece of jewelry. The necklace shimmered with a richness that mirrored her own life, an extraordinary life, built with love, sacrifice, and mutual respect between her and her husband, Michael. She wore it as a testament to the decade of shared memories that defined their marriage. Michael, the police chief of Greenville, had given it to her on their 10th wedding anniversary, a symbol of the love he had always promised her, no matter how chaotic the world around them became. Sophia had lived in Greenville for most of her life. She knew the streets like the back of her hand, the way the light fell on the pavement in the early morning, how the city smelled after a rainstorm, the places where the local children played, and the neighborhoods where the elderly still sat on their porches, telling stories of a time long past. Her connection to the city was deep, woven into the fabric of its history, and yet today, that connection was being tested in a way she never could have imagined. Sophia's thoughts drifted to Michael as she walked, the quiet of the moment offering her a brief respite from the responsibilities she carried as his wife. Michael was not just any man, he was a man of integrity. His work as the chief of police required him to stand tall in the face of adversity, to make tough decisions that impacted the lives of others. Sophia admired him for his unwavering commitment to justice, his ability to separate personal emotions from the duties of his job. But as she moved through the streets, she couldn't shake the sense that something was off in the air today, a feeling that had settled like a heavy fog around her chest. As she passed a corner, she saw him. Officer Ethan Clark, leaning against the patrol car, sipping from a steaming cup of coffee, his posture cocky and unbothered. Ethan had a reputation in Greenville, not for his bravery or commitment to the law, but for his arrogance and biases that ran deeper than anyone was willing to admit. His sneer was practically a permanent feature of his face, as though the very existence of others displeased him. And it wasn't just his attitude that made people uneasy, it was the way he saw himself, the way he carried the uniform like a badge of superiority, a weapon for asserting dominance over those he considered beneath him. As Sophia walked past him, the soft click of her sandals on the cobblestone seemed to catch his attention. His eyes, sharp and calculating, immediately locked onto the gold necklace around her neck. The gleam of the jewelry seemed to provoke something inside of him, an impulse he couldn't quite control. "What's this, then?" Ethan's voice cut through the air, harsh and demanding. Sophia paused, turning to meet his gaze, her calm expression betraying none of the surprise she felt. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice soft but confident, a quiet reminder of the strength she carried within her. Ethan took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing, examining the necklace with an air of suspicion. "That necklace," he said slowly, "where did you get it?" Sophia's brows furrowed in confusion, but she held her ground. "It's a gift from my husband," she explained, the words rolling off her tongue easily. "It's mine." But Ethan wasn't convinced. His eyes traced the necklace again, his expression hardening. "A gift, huh?" His voice dripped with condescension. "It looks expensive. You sure it's yours?" Sophia's chest tightened. The unspoken accusation was hanging in the air, a weight she had become all too familiar with over the years. She had never considered herself someone who was other, but with one glance from Ethan, she suddenly felt like she didn't belong. It wasn't the necklace he was concerned with, it was her, the fact that she was walking down the street with such a thing around her neck. His gaze, filled with suspicion, seemed to suggest that she didn't deserve it. That it was too much for someone like her. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice steady, though a flicker of unease stirred within her. This necklace belongs to me. I don't know about any jewelry thefts. Ethan's lips curled into a sneer. You don't get it, do you? He said, stepping closer, his towering presence making her feel small. We've had reports of stolen jewelry, and you match the description of the thief. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know how this game is played? Sophia stood tall, her gaze unwavering. She had faced prejudice before, but something about the way he spoke, the way he sized her up, made her stomach twist with anger. I'm not the one stealing, she replied coolly, the words sharp as a blade. I'm not your suspect. Ethan's eyes darkened, his ego bruised. We'll sort this out at the station, he muttered, as he moved toward her, reaching for the handcuffs at his belt. Sophia's heart raced, but she didn't show it. She knew that reacting with anger, with fear, would only give him more power over her. But she also knew that she had to make a choice. She couldn't let him take her in without a fight, not without knowing the truth would come to light eventually. She didn't believe in taking matters into her own hands violently, but she did believe in standing up for what was right. She turned away and subtly slipped her phone out of her pocket, pressing a button she knew Michael would recognize. The signal was a quiet one, a call for help, a call that she trusted would be received with the urgency it deserved. Without saying another word, Ethan grabbed her arm, twisting it roughly as he slapped the cold handcuffs around her wrists. You're coming with me, he snarled, dragging her toward the patrol car. As Sophia was shoved into the back seat of the car, she could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. She wasn't just a woman being taken to the police station, she was the wife of the police chief. She was someone who had been judged not for the truth of her actions, but for the color of her skin and the perceived value of her necklace. In the back of that patrol car, with the sound of Ethan's smug voice filling the air, Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, her thoughts on Michael. She knew he would never let this stand. But more than that, she knew that this moment, this injustice, was bigger than herself. It was a moment that spoke to the broken systems in their city, to the prejudices that ran deeper than anyone cared to acknowledge. Sophia wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been unjustly judged, every person who had ever been forced to walk a road that was never meant for them. And she would not back down.